After raising a son with every sacrifice we could make, I never thought the day would come when he would tell me and my wife that the only way we could eat was by scrubbing dirty dishes in his restaurant. Imagine being treated like strangers in the very place our own savings helped build. But what I did next didn't just shock my son, it shocked everyone in that restaurant. And before I continue, tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Dallas, Houston, Chicago, Atlanta, New York, or right here in a small town like mine. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You know, when you get to my age, you stop caring much about the noise of the world. The money, the titles, the show, it all fades. What stays with you are the nights you went without sleep to put bread on the table, the times you worked with your hands until they cracked, and the small victories that kept your family moving forward. That's what I carried through most of my life. I wasn't born into much, and neither was my wife. We built what we had $1 at a time, one sacrifice at a time. There were winters where the heat almost got shut off, summers where we prayed the old car would last one more season. But through it all, we kept one promise. Our boy would never feel the hunger or the worry that followed us in our youth. We'd shoulder it so he wouldn't have to. I remember her sitting up late at night, sewing torn shirts so he'd have something decent for school. I remember walking out before dawn, lunch pail in hand, headed to jobs that broke my back but kept food on his plate. We gave him everything we could, even things we couldn't afford, because that's what parents do. You carry the burden so your children can walk a little lighter. And for a long time, I thought he understood. I thought he carried those memories with him, tucked somewhere in his heart. But time has a way of showing you what you missed. And as I sit here now, looking back, I realize the hardest blow doesn't come from strangers or enemies. It comes when the child you sacrificed for forgets the very hands that fed him. That's where my story begins. I still remember the day he came to us, chest puffed out, eyes shining with that kind of confidence only youth can carry. He said he was going to open a restaurant. Not just talk about it, not dream about it, but actually do it. My wife's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a little boy winning his first baseball game. She clapped her hands together, proud as could be, and said, "Finally, all your hard work is paying off." I just sat there quiet, letting it sink in. In all honesty, a part of me swelled with pride, too. I thought about how far we had come those nights of scraping coins off the dresser, the times we skipped meals so he could eat a full plate, and now here he was, talking about building something of his own. He showed us the sketches, menus, even a business plan he printed off the computer. And when he mentioned the money he needed to get started, I didn't hesitate. My wife and I looked at each other, and without a word, we both knew what we'd do. We pulled from the savings we had tucked away the money we thought might one day keep us comfortable in old age, and slid it across the table to him. It wasn't a loan in my mind. It was a father's final gift, a mother's last act of sacrifice. We thought, if he succeeds, then we've done our job. I patted him on the back and said, "Son, make us proud. This is your chance to stand tall." In that moment, I never could have imagined how those same walls we helped him build would one day become the place where he would break us down. The day finally came when the restaurant opened its doors. My wife insisted we dress nice, said she wanted to look presentable for our boy's big moment. She pulled out the good dress she only wore on Sundays, and I pressed my old shirt, the one I usually saved for church. We walked hand in hand, hearts full, ready to see what our sacrifices had built. When we stepped through those doors, the smell hit us first, fresh bread baking, onions sizzling, something rich simmering on the stove. The kind of smell that makes a man close his eyes and breathe a little deeper. My wife leaned in close and whispered, "Can you believe it? Our son did this." The place was alive with chatter, tables filled, waiters darting back and forth with plates that looked like works of art. For a moment, I forgot every hardship we had ever faced. I thought, this is what it was all for. We found a spot near the window where sunlight spilled across the table. My wife squeezed my hand, her eyes glassy with pride. I could see it written all over her face: relief, joy, gratitude. She believed this was the start of something good, a reward after a lifetime of labor. I sat there quietly, letting the scene wash over me. Every laugh, every clinking glass, every bite of food, it felt like a celebration of our boy's future. I told myself, this is his moment, and we're blessed just to witness it. If only I had known then that the same walls echoing with laughter that day would soon hold whispers of shame for us. If only I had known that pride can sour into something unrecognizable when respect is lost. That was the first visit. And though my wife and I smiled through it, what followed next would test us in ways we never imagined. When the waiter came by with menus, I thought nothing of it. I reached for one, ready to order a meal like any proud father in his son's restaurant would. My wife already had her eye on the chicken pot pie. But before we could speak a word, our son appeared at the table. No smile, no hug, no warmth in his eyes. Just that sharp look of business, like we were customers instead of his own flesh and blood. He leaned on the table and said, plain as day, "You can't just sit down and eat here. Nothing's free in my world." At first, I thought I'd misheard him. My wife blinked, confused, and let out a nervous laugh, waiting for the joke. But his face didn't soften. He was serious. I cleared my throat and asked, "Son, what do you mean?" He crossed his arms and said, "If you want food, you'll need to work for it. Wash some dishes, clean a few tables. That's how things are done here." My wife's smile faded. Her hand slipped from mine, and she sat there stunned, like someone had just pulled the floor out from under her. For a moment, I could hear nothing but the clatter of plates and the murmur of other diners carrying on with their meals, unaware of the storm that had just fallen over our table. I swallowed hard, the taste of pride bitter on my tongue. All I could think was, this was the boy we starved ourselves for, the boy we carried through every hardship. And now, in the house our sacrifices helped build, we were being treated like strangers, like beggars, asking for charity. That was the first time I felt the sting of shame in his restaurant, but it would not be the last. Our son didn't stop with those cold words at the table. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough so that it felt like he was driving a knife into us quietly, without anyone else noticing. "You two want to eat here," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Then you'll do like everyone else who works for me. Nothing is free. Not for anyone." My wife's lips parted as if to plead, but nothing came out. Her eyes filled with tears she was too proud to let fall in front of him. I saw her clutch at her purse, holding it tight against her stomach like it might shield her from what he'd just said. I stared at him, searching for some trace of the little boy. I once knew the one who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, the one who used to beg his mama for one more story before sleep. But there was nothing, just a hardened face, proud and cold, looking down at the people who gave him life. I asked quietly, "So what is it you want from us, son?" He didn't hesitate. "You'll wash dishes. You'll bus tables. You'll put in work like anyone else on my payroll. That's the only way you'll get a plate here. You either accept that, or you don't eat." His words hung in the air like smoke. My wife gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. And I just sat there, my body heavy, my chest aching in a way I hadn't felt since burying my own father. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. Part of me wanted to rise up, slam my fist on that polished table, and remind him whose shoulders he had climbed to get here. But another part of me, the older, more tired part, just sat in silence. It was then I realized something painful. This wasn't just about food. It was about respect. And respect, once lost, leaves a wound deeper than hunger ever could. That was his ultimatum: work or go without. He didn't give us time to argue or even gather our thoughts. One of the younger employees, barely older than our grandson, brought over 2 aprons. They smelled faintly of bleach and old sweat, rough against the hands. My wife looked down at hers as though it were a shroud. With trembling fingers, she tied it around her waist. I did the same, though my hands were steadier. Years of work had trained them to move without showing the storm inside me. Still, when I pulled that apron tight, it felt less like cloth and more like chains. We were led into the back. past the swinging doors that separated the laughter of customers from the clatter of labor. The kitchen was hot steam rising off pans, water hissing on the stove, voices shouting orders over the hum of fans. It was the sort of place meant for the young, not for two bodies worn down by decades of toil. A stack of dishes sat in front of us, tall as a tower. Grease smeared across the plates. Silverware tangled in piles. My wife reached for the sponge, her hand shaking as though the weight of her son's words were still pressing down on her. She scrubbed one dish, then another, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were scrubbing away not food but dignity. I rolled up my sleeves and joined her, plunging my hands into scalding water. The sting on my skin felt almost right. It matched the burn in my chest. Every plate I washed was a memory. The soup we once shared around a chipped kitchen table. The bread she baked when we could barely afford flour. The boy who once licked the bowl clean and asked for seconds. Now, here we were, cleaning up after strangers, all so we could earn a plate of food in our own son's restaurant. When I looked over at my wife, I saw her bite her lip to keep from crying. I wanted to tell her to take off that apron, to walk out with me. But hunger is a cruel master. Pride bends under it. And so, we worked. That was our first shift, our introduction to the house we helped build, but no longer belonged to. It didn't take long before the whispers began. The kitchen doors swung on their hinges, waiters pushing through with trays stacked high, and every now and then, a customer's eyes caught ours. At first, they just glanced. Maybe they thought we were new hires, two old-timers picking up part-time work to keep busy. But then recognition set in. A woman paused mid-bite, her fork hanging in the air. A man at the bar leaned over to whisper something to his friend. Heads turned. I caught the look in their eyes, that uncomfortable mix of pity and curiosity. Some even smiled faintly, the kind of smile you give when you don't know whether to laugh or feel sorry. One voice cut through the chatter, just a murmur, but loud enough for me to hear, "Aren't those his parents?" My ears burned. My back stiffened as I kept scrubbing the dish in my hands, but the sting of those words pressed down harder than any labor I'd ever known. My wife, poor soul, tried to hide behind her work. She lowered her head, hair falling across her face, scrubbing as though she could make herself invisible. But there was no hiding. Each time the door swung open, there we were on display, like some kind of cruel exhibit. The proud parents who had given everything, now bent over sinks, earning scraps in the shadow of their own son's success. I remember one young couple walking by, their laughter halting as they recognized us. The girl's smile faded. She tugged at her boyfriend's sleeve and whispered something, her eyes lingering on us just long enough to twist the knife. They looked at us the way you look at a stray dog, something to pity, but not to touch. I wanted to turn to tell them the truth, that the walls around them, the chairs they sat on, the food they enjoyed, were all born of our sacrifices. But the words caught in my throat. My pride kept me silent. My shame kept me working. And through it all, my son never once stepped in to shield us from those stares. In fact, when he passed by, he smirked, almost proud to show the world that his parents were earning their place in his restaurant. That day, the sting of soap and grease on my hands was nothing compared to the sting in my heart. The clatter of dishes had barely quieted when he stepped through the swinging doors. My son, my own flesh and blood, walked into that kitchen as though he were a king surveying his kingdom. His tie was neat, his shoes polished, and the smell of his expensive cologne cut through the steam and soap. He looked at us, bent over those sinks, and instead of shame softening his face, there was pride. He let out a short laugh, the kind that drips with condescension. Then he said it, loud enough for the cooks and the waiters to hear. "Nothing's free in my world. You taught me that." I froze, the dish in my hands slick with grease and water. My wife dropped her sponge, her fingers too weak to hold on. We both turned toward him, stunned, searching for any sign that he might be joking. But his eyes were cold, sharp, and unflinching. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we never taught him cruelty. We taught him hard work, yes. We taught him sacrifice, yes. But never did we teach him to turn his back on the hands that fed him. The staff went quiet. Even the young dishwasher next to me slowed his scrubbing, his eyes flicking nervously between us and my son. It was as if the whole room could feel the weight of his words pressing down. My wife finally spoke, her voice small, fragile. "We never asked you for anything, son." But he just shook his head, that smirk still hanging on his lips. "Then consider this your lesson. Everyone works for what they eat, no exceptions." The way he said it, it wasn't just a rule, it was a declaration. A line drawn in the sand between us and him, between parents and child, between love and pride. I stood there in silence, the ache in my chest heavier than any debt I'd ever carried. For the first time in my life, I felt the true meaning of betrayal. Not from an enemy, not from a stranger, but from the very son we had sacrificed everything for. And in that moment, I knew this wound would not heal quickly, if at all. It didn't take long before the work began wearing her down. My wife has always been strong in her quiet way, stronger than me in some respects. She held our home together through storms, sickness, and hunger. But standing there in that hot, unforgiving kitchen, bent over sinks meant for younger backs, I saw the years in her face more clearly than ever. Her hands, once steady and sure, trembled as she tried to scrub. The soap made her skin raw. The heat flushed her cheeks. She wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, but the sweat kept coming. Every plate she lifted seemed heavier than the last, and I could see her shoulders slumping with each passing minute. At one point, she was asked to carry a tray of glasses out to the front. I watched her struggle with the weight, her knees wobbling as she walked. My instinct was to take it from her, but the manager, a boy half her age, shook his head and muttered, "She's got it." She didn't. The tray rattled, the glasses clinking together as she fought to keep her balance. My heart nearly stopped. I stepped forward, ready to catch her, but before I could, our son appeared again. He crossed his arms, watching her with that cold smirk. And then he said, clear enough for the staff around us to hear, "Maybe you should have taken better care of yourself, Ma. Can't blame me if you can't keep up." The words hit her harder than the weight of that tray. Her chin quivered, her lips pressed together, but she refused to cry in front of him. I saw her swallow that pain the way she'd swallowed every hardship life ever threw her way. I wanted to shout, to tear that tray from her hands and tell him to mind his tongue, but I didn't. My voice caught somewhere deep in my chest, trapped beneath years of pride and shame. Instead, I stood there helpless, watching the woman who once nursed him through fevers, now mocked for her weakness by the very child she saved. That sight will haunt me longer than any labor I've ever endured. By then, my pride was bleeding out of me like water through a cracked jar. Every scrape of a plate, every hiss of boiling water seemed to remind me of who I once was and who I had been reduced to. I had spent a lifetime working with these hands. They built houses, fixed engines, carried lumber, and held my wife steady when the world threatened to break her. These hands had never begged, never folded for pity. Yet here they were, raw and pruned from dishwater, laboring not for a wage, but for the right to eat in a place my own money helped build. I caught sight of myself in the reflection of a steel counter apron tied tight, shoulders hunched, face hollow from years of sacrifice. And I thought, is this what fatherhood comes to? Is this the thanks for a lifetime of giving? Part of me wanted to tear that apron off, throw it on the floor, and walk out with my head high, even if it meant going home hungry. My father's voice echoed in my memory. A man's dignity is worth more than a full belly. But then I looked at my wife. She was pale, her lips pressed thin, but she kept moving, wiping tables, carrying water, standing under the weight of her own humiliation. She didn't complain, not once. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't staying for pride or for respect. She was staying because her stomach ached, and because she was too tired to fight. Hunger is a cruel master. It doesn't care about dignity. It bends a man's back, makes him swallow words he never thought he'd bite down on. That night, I chose hunger's leash over pride's freedom. I bent my head and kept scrubbing. Still, something inside me cracked. It wasn't a loud break, it was quiet, like a bone giving way under pressure. I knew then that no matter how long we worked in that place, no matter how many plates we cleaned, Something between us and our son was broken forever. That was the breaking point, not in my body, but in my spirit. It's a strange thing when other people begin to notice your shame. At first I thought maybe no one paid attention, just another old couple doing a bit of work to pass the time. But eyes see more than mouths admit, and soon I felt the weight of their stares pressing in on us. The waitstaff were the first. Young kids, most of them, barely out of school. They'd watch me scrub pans that were heavier than my arms could stand, or see my wife leaning against the counter to catch her breath. They didn't say much, but I could see it in the way they moved slower around us, like they were trying to shield us from more work. One young waitress, a girl with freckles and kind eyes, slipped me an extra roll of bread when no one was looking. She whispered, "This isn't right, sir." Her words nearly undid me. I swallowed hard and nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. What could I say? That I knew? That I felt the wrongness in every bone of my body? Even customers began to whisper. A man at the bar leaned over to his wife, nodding toward us. I caught the words, "That's his parents, isn't it?" The woman's face softened with pity, then hardened with something else, disgust. Maybe, not at us, but at the son who had put us there. It stung worse than the work itself, knowing strangers could see what my son refused to. I would rather have broken my back in silence than endure pity from people who had no stake in our lives. But what cut deepest wasn't their stares, it was my son's indifference to them. He saw the glances, heard the murmurs, and still he carried himself with pride, chest out, as though making us work was proof of his strength. I realized then that respect wasn't just gone, it had been replaced with something colder, and the worst part was, the world could see it just as clearly as we could. As I stood there with my hands deep in soap water, I couldn't help but drift back to the years when life was harder, but somehow kinder. I remembered nights when my wife and I went to bed with empty stomachs, just so our boy could have a full plate. She would slide her portion onto his plate when he wasn't looking, and when he asked why she wasn't hungry, she'd smile and say, "Mama had a big lunch. I knew better, but I never called her on it." That was her way, quiet sacrifice, never demanding thanks. There were winters when the cupboards held more dust than food. I'd come home late, dead tired, and she'd be sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out like a battlefield, trying to stretch $1 into $2. She once pawned her wedding locket, her mother's locket, just so we could keep milk in the fridge. I asked her how she could let it go. She just said, "Our boy's belly matters more than my jewelry." And I remembered my own hands, calloused from factory shifts, gripping a lunch pail that sometimes carried nothing but coffee and a slice of bread. I'd sit in the break room, listening to the others chew hearty meals, while I saved what I had for him. We carried him through storms, sickness, and hunger. We clothed him when we couldn't clothe ourselves. Every decision, every sacrifice, every sleepless night done so he could stand taller than we ever could. And yet, here we were, decades later, washing dishes in his restaurant, earning scraps as though we were strangers at his table. The echo of those sacrifices rang louder in my ears than the clatter of plates, and I thought to myself, if he had even one clear memory of those nights, he would never have put us here. That thought cut deeper than any insult he could ever throw. Somewhere between the endless plates and the endless whispers, it struck me this wasn't about food at all. Hunger was only the surface wound. What cut deep was something far worse. Respect. That was the real meal being withheld. And no amount of dishwashing could earn it back. I'd worked all my life with the understanding that respect was a man's backbone. You could be poor, you could be tired, you could be broken down by the weight of the world, but if your children still looked at you with honor, then you hadn't lost everything. That respect was worth more than full cupboards, more than money in the bank. But now, in that kitchen, with my wife bent over like a servant and my son strutting through the dining room like a king, I realized we had been stripped of it, not by strangers, not by society, but by the very child we had raised with our own hands. It wasn't about earning a plate of food. We could have gone home and boiled potatoes, could have opened a can of beans. No, this was about a man who looked at his parents and decided they weren't worthy of the seat they once gave him at their table. That truth hit me harder than any hunger ever could. Hunger passes. Shame lingers. And as I stood there with soapy hands and a heavy heart, I knew something inside me had shifted. This was no longer just a son teaching us his version of hard lessons. This was a son forgetting who we were. And when respect is lost, a family is no longer whole. As I stood there, staring at my wife's tired hands trembling over the sink, another truth rose up inside me, one I'd nearly forgotten in all the humiliation. This restaurant, these walls, the polished tables, the glowing lights, it wasn't built on his back alone. No. Half the money that birthed this place had come from us. From the savings my wife and I tucked away through decades of sweat. Money we thought might buy us a little peace in our old age. Money we handed over without hesitation the day he said, "Ma, Dad, I just need a start." I remember sliding that envelope across the table, her eyes glistening with hope. We didn't see it as an investment. We saw it as a gift, parents laying down one more sacrifice so their child could stand taller. We never asked for a contract, never asked for repayment, never once thought he would turn those very dollars into shackles for us. And yet here we were. Every plate I scrubbed, every table she wiped down. I couldn't help but think we had already paid for these meals 1,000 times over. With our money, with our labor, with our lives. But my son had forgotten. Or worse, he remembered and didn't care. I dried my hands on that bleach-stained apron and looked across the kitchen at him, laughing with customers, proud of his empire. My heart sank as the truth burned hotter in me than the dishwater. This place wasn't just his. It was ours. And he had no right at all to treat us like beggars in a house we helped build. That was the hidden truth. And I knew then, sooner or later, it would have to come out. That night, after the last plates were scrubbed and the floors mopped, my wife and I walked home in silence. The streets were quiet, but my mind was louder than it had been in years. Every step I took, I replayed his words, his smirk, the way he stood taller while we bent lower. When we got inside, she sat down heavy in her chair, her hands still red and raw from the dishwater. She didn't look at me, just stared at the floor, lost somewhere between exhaustion and heartbreak. I'd seen her tired before, but this was different. This was the weariness of a woman carrying shame she never deserved. I sat across from her, the weight in my chest nearly crushing me. For a long time, I didn't speak. I just watched her, and all I could think was, she gave up everything for him. And he has taken it all, even her dignity. That's when it hit me clear and cold. This couldn't go on. We weren't children who needed teaching, nor beggars who needed feeding. We were his parents, the very foundation he stood on. And if he couldn't see that, then I had to remind him. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and said quietly, almost to myself, "Tomorrow, we stop." Her head lifted, her eyes dull with fatigue, but she heard me. She searched my face, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of something return trust, relief. Maybe even the faint shadow of the woman who once believed every storm could be weathered if we faced it together. She nodded, slow and steady, and whispered, "All right." That was it. No long discussion, no argument. Just a quiet agreement between two old souls who had been through too much to bend any further. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, we would reclaim what little dignity we had left. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the truth he had buried. The truth we had to bring to light. The next morning, I rose before the sun, same way I had for most of my working life. But this time felt different. There was no rush in my step, no hope that today might be better. Instead, there was a calm, like a man walking toward a storm he's already made peace with. My wife dressed slowly, her hands stiff from the ache of yesterday. She didn't speak much, but when she tied that apron around her waist one last time, she gave me a look that said more than words ever could. It was the look of a woman who knew this chapter was about to end. When we stepped back into the restaurant, the air smelled the same rich food, butter sizzling, coffee brewing, but for us, it carried no warmth anymore. It was just the scent of a place that had stolen our pride. He was already there, strutting between tables, shaking hands with customers as though he'd built it all on his own. When he saw us slip into the kitchen, He didn't bother with a greeting. He just pointed at the sink and barked, "Dishes are piling up! Get to it!" So we did. Quietly, steadily, the same way we had always carried our burdens. But this time, every plate I scrubbed, every glass I dried, I told myself, this is the last one. I looked around that kitchen, memorizing every detail, the scuffed counters, the steam rising from the pots, the sound of orders being shouted across the line. I let it all etch itself into my mind, not as a memory of defeat, but as the stage where the truth would finally be laid bare. My wife worked beside me, slower than usual, her body worn thin. I reached over, placed my hand lightly on hers, and gave it a squeeze. She looked up at me, and in her tired eyes, I saw the same resolve burning in my chest. This was it. Today, we would stop bending. Today, we would lay down the truth that had been hidden too long. It was our final day in that kitchen, but it was also the day everything changed. The rush of the dinner hour was in full swing when I knew the moment had come. The place was packed, families laughing, silverware clinking, glasses raised. The noise of it all seemed to fade in my ears as I untied the knot at the back of my apron. I pulled it off slowly, folding it once in my hands. My wife noticed, and without hesitation, she did the same. For a moment, we just stood there, two old people in a kitchen full of steam and noise, holding aprons that had become symbols of our humiliation. Then I stepped out from behind the sink. The room quieted, just a little, as the sight of us drew eyes. Maybe it was the solemnity in the way we moved. Maybe it was the way my wife clutched her apron to her chest like a flag folded at a funeral. My son saw us and frowned. "What are you doing? Get back to work!" His voice cut through the chatter, sharp and commanding. But I didn't move. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out an envelope worn from years of handling, its corners bent. I laid it gently on the counter, right in front of him. "Do you recognize this?" I asked, my voice steady but carrying enough weight that even the customers in the front turned their heads. He glanced down, confused. Inside were the old bank records, the checks with my handwriting, the proof of the savings my wife and I had drained to help him open those very doors. "This restaurant," I said, my voice louder now, "was not built on your back alone. It was built on the sacrifices of the two people standing before you, the ones who went hungry so you could eat, the ones who pawned heirlooms so you could stand taller, the ones who gave you everything only to be treated as less than strangers in the house we helped you build." A hush fell over the room. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Staff stood still, their eyes darting between us and him. My wife stepped closer, her voice trembling but clear. "We never asked for repayment. We never asked for anything, only respect, and you've taken even that away." I looked around at the faces, watching the pity, the shock, the dawning shame, and then I turned back to my son. "You think we're here to earn a meal? Son, we already paid for every plate in this house a long time ago." The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, not pride, not defiance, but fear. Fear of truth laid bare in front of everyone. That was the confrontation. Not a shout, not a fight, but a father standing tall one last time, and a son finally exposed for what he had become. The silence in that restaurant stretched long and heavy, the kind that makes a man's heartbeat sound louder than the clatter of dishes. All eyes were on us, an old couple standing in plain clothes, aprons folded in our hands, and a truth laid bare on the counter for everyone to see. My son's jaw tightened. He reached for the envelope, but his hand trembled when he touched it. He glanced up and found the faces staring at him, customers, staff, even friends he'd bragged to. Their expressions weren't admiration anymore. They were questions, disbelief, disgust. A murmur rippled through the room. "Did they really fund it?" Someone whispered near the bar. "All this time, and he made them wash dishes?" Another voice hissed. The young waitress who had slipped me bread earlier stood frozen, her lips pressed tight as though she wanted to speak but didn't dare. A cook leaned against the kitchen doorway, shaking his head slowly. Even the laughter of children at one of the booths had stilled, their parents pulling them close, eyes fixed on the scene unraveling before them. My wife lifted her chin, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried through the room. "We gave him everything, and still he asked for more." It was like a stone thrown into a pond. Her words rippled outward, reaching every table. A man in a business suit muttered, "Shameful." A woman near the window crossed her arms and said, "I'd never treat my parents that way." And just like that, the air shifted. It wasn't just our burden anymore, it was his. The weight of his choices pressed down, not hidden behind polished smiles or fancy meals, but out in the open for all to see. I turned to him, my voice calm, almost weary. "Respect, son. That's what you lost today. And no amount of money will ever buy it back." For the first time, he didn't have a reply. He stood there, staring at us, his face stripped bare of arrogance. Only silence remained, and silence can be the loudest judgment of all. That was the exposure. The moment when truth stopped being ours to carry alone and became his to answer for in front of the world. I didn't wait for him to answer. I didn't need to. The silence, the whispers, the shame hanging heavy in the air, it said more than words ever could. I folded the apron in my hands one last time and laid it gently on the counter. My wife did the same, pressing hers down beside mine with fingers that no longer trembled. We stood tall, taller than we had in years, not because our bodies were strong, but because truth has a way of straightening even the most weary back. I reached for her hand. She gave it to me without hesitation, her palm small and warm in mine, the same hand that had carried me through every trial of our lives. And together, without a single backward glance, we walked out. The room was silent as we moved through it. Chairs scraped as people shifted, eyes following us, some with pity, others with admiration. No one stopped us. No one dared. Even my son, who only hours earlier barked orders at us like we were, nothing stood rooted to the spot, his mouth shut, his pride crumbling before the very eyes that once praised him. When we reached the door, I paused, just for a breath, letting the cool night air brush against my face. It felt different, like freedom, like shedding chains I hadn't realized were weighing me down. We stepped into the street, side by side, not as beggars, not as workers, but as parents who had finally drawn the line. It wasn't food we carried away that night. It was dignity. And for two old souls who had given everything, that was enough. That was our walkout, not with anger, not with shouting, but with the quiet strength of knowing we had seen enough and finally, chosen ourselves. When you live long enough, you learn something the hard way. Life doesn't always wound you with poverty, sickness, or strangers. Sometimes the deepest cut comes from your own blood. Not because they don't know better, but because they've forgotten the nights you starved so they could eat, forgotten the miles you walked so they could ride, forgotten the prayers whispered over their beds when you were too tired to stand. That night in his restaurant, I realized something I should have known all along. Food fills the belly, but respect feeds the soul. And once respect is gone, no meal in this world will ever satisfy. We didn't walk out empty-handed. No, we walked out with something stronger than his menu, his money, or his pride. We walked out with our dignity. And for an old man and his wife, after a lifetime of sacrifice, that was worth more than anything. So I'll leave you with this. Respect your parents. They may not be perfect, but they gave you more than you'll ever fully understand until it's too late. And if you've got parents still living, call them, thank them, love them while you still can. Because respect, once lost, is harder to buy back than time itself. And before I close, let me ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Dallas? Houston? Chicago? Atlanta? Maybe New York? Or maybe from a quiet little town like mine? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because these stories aren't just mine. They belong to every parent who's given everything, and every child who needs to remember it. See you in the next story.